The tribunal clerk read the 47th refusal into the record, and Queen Silvara Kethnori of the Delveni sovereignty felt the chamber's silence land on her like a burial shroud. Suitor 47, the clerk intoned, his voice flat as polished stone, Lord Hecorin of the Nithari Compact, formally withdraws his candidacy, citing irreconcilable biological variance, and a pause, his gaze flickering to Silvara, temperamental incompatibility. Temperamental incompatibility. Silvara's jaw tightened. She kept her hands flat on the arms of the adjudicator's chair, her claws retracted, her breathing even. Temperamental incompatibility was what they said when they meant the Queen has teeth and she is not afraid to show them. 47 refusals in 11 months. Every eligible male of rank within the Concord's 13 recognized species had been offered her hand under Article 91 of the Galactic Continuation Statute, and every one of them had found a reason to walk away. Too fierce, too proud, too alien, even among aliens. The Delveni were an old species, predatory ancestry, infrared-sensitive vision, retractable claws, a territorial instinct bred into them over 60,000 years of evolution, and Silvara was the last of the imperial bloodline. The statute was clear. A sovereign without an heir forfeited their seat on the Concord within 18 standard months. She had 7 weeks left. The tribunal's senior adjudicator, a Vithari named Counselor Dren, folded his translucent hands and leaned toward the microphone. The tribunal acknowledges the withdrawal. We note for the record that one candidacy remains on the register. He glanced at his tablet. Suitor 48, a human. The word landed in the chamber like something dropped from a height. Silvara's nostrils flared. She could smell the shift in the room, the faint chemical spike of amusement from the Vithori delegation, the sharper note of pity from the Kelori observers. A human. The Concord's newest species, barely 2 centuries into galactic participation, still considered provisional members by half the seated delegations. They had no royal lineages, no recognized noble houses, no genetic compatibility studies on file with the Bureau of Continuation. They were engineers and traders and soldiers, useful, certainly, but not consort material, not for the Queen of one of the Concord's founding species. "You cannot be serious," Silvara said. "The statute does not specify species, Your Majesty," Dren replied, his tone carrying the practiced neutrality of a man who had presided over 1,000 contractual disputes. "It specifies only that the candidate be of recognized sapient status, unattached and willing. The human candidate meets all 3 criteria." "Who is he?" Dren checked his tablet again. "Commander Tobin Ward, Terran Coalition Navy, retired, currently serving as a logistics liaison to the Concord's Frontier Supply Commission, age 41 standard. No prior marriages, no offspring, no outstanding legal obligations." A logistics liaison. Silvara closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. They were offering her a supply clerk. "Bring him in," she said. The chamber doors opened, and the man who walked through them was not what she expected. She had prepared herself for something soft. The Concord's humans tended toward a certain earnest pliability that she found grating, but Commander Tobin Ward moved like someone who had been hit before and had learned which direction to lean. He was tall for a human, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped dark hair gone gray at the temples and a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, a nose broken at least once, a jaw that could have been cut from ship hull plating, steady dark eyes under heavy brows. He wore a plain charcoal jacket over a high-collared shirt, no insignia, no rank markers. He stopped at the designated mark on the floor, 6 meters from Silvara's chair, and stood at a loose attention that was more habit than performance. He did not bow. The Delveni custom was a lowered gaze, and he did not do that either. He simply looked at her, his expression neutral, and waited. Salvara studied him the way she studied everything, with the predator's patience her species was known for, the slow assessment that most aliens found unnerving. His heartbeat was visible in the vein at his temple, 62 beats per minute, steady, unaccelerated. He was not afraid of her. That at least was unusual. "Commander Ward," Dren began, "you have been registered as a candidate under Article 91 of the Galactic Continuation Statute. You understand the terms. If the Queen accepts your candidacy and the tribunal ratifies the match, you will be bound by Delveni sovereign law for a minimum period of 5 standard years," Ward said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that carried in a room without needing to be raised. "Residence at the Sovereign's Court, participation in the continuation obligation, full submission to Delveni jurisdictional authority for the duration of the contract. I read the statute." "You read the statute," Salvara repeated, her tone flat. "Twice," Ward said, "the second time with a legal dictionary." A Kalori observer in the gallery made a sound that might have been a laugh. Salvara ignored it. She leaned forward slightly, and she saw Ward's eyes track the movement, not flinching, just noting it, the way a man notes the position of a door in an unfamiliar room. "Why?" she asked. Ward considered the question. She watched him consider it, not scrambling for an answer, but genuinely weighing what to say. That was unusual too. "Because nobody else would," he said. The words were simple. They were not what she wanted to hear. She wanted to hear ambition, or calculation, or at least the clean, mercenary logic she could respect. What she got instead was something that sounded dangerously close to compassion, and compassion from a human directed at a Delveni queen was an insult she had no protocol for. "You pity me," she said, and let the edge show. "No," Ward's expression did not change. "I watched 47 men look at you and see a problem. That's not pity, that's disagreement." The chamber went quiet. Even Dren stopped pretending to check his tablet. Salvara held Ward's gaze for a long count of 5. His heartbeat did not change. His pupils did not dilate. He was either remarkably well-trained or remarkably honest, and she could not yet tell which was more dangerous. "Ratify the candidacy," she said to Dren. "The human stays." The tribunal sealed the match 11 minutes later. As the chamber emptied, Salvara watched Ward sign the contract, a physical document, because Delveni sovereign law still required ink on pressed mineral fiber. His handwriting was neat, unhurried, the letters of a man who had spent decades filling out requisition forms and maintenance logs. He signed his full name without hesitation. She noticed that he did not read the exit clause. Either he had already memorized it, or he did not intend to use it. The Delveni sovereign palace was a fortress carved into a cliff face on the night side of Kethnora's capital continent, a sprawling labyrinth of obsidian corridors, vaulted audience chambers, and private quarters that had not seen a consort's presence in 14 years. Salvara had ruled alone since the death of her father, the last emperor, and the palace had shaped itself to her solitude, vast, echoing, efficient, cold. The light panels in the consort's wing had been set to minimum output for so long that 3 had burned out entirely, and no one had noticed because no one walked those corridors. Ward arrived with one bag. A single military duffel, scuffed and patched, containing what Salvara's household steward later inventoried as 4 changes of clothes, a maintenance kit for a sidearm he no longer carried, a battered datapad, a physical book with a cracked spine, and a jar of something labeled instant coffee, emergency reserve. She watched the inventory report scroll across her personal terminal and felt something that was not quite irritation and not quite curiosity. 1 bag. 47 suitors had arrived with cargo transports, crates of personal effects, wardrobe modules, entire retinues of servants and advisors. Ward had a duffel. The first 3 days were a controlled disaster. Ward was assigned quarters in the consort's wing rooms that had been sealed for over a decade, hastily aired and furnished by a staff that regarded the human with the careful blankness of people who had opinions they were not permitted to express. Salvara's senior advisor, a Delveni elder named Vorath, made his position clear on the morning of the second day. "The court considers this arrangement provisional at best," Vorath told her, his voice carrying the carefully modulated disapproval that was his specialty. "A human consort is without precedent. The Delveni genetic compatibility studies have not been conducted. The noble houses are already circulating a petition to invoke the invalidity clause." "Let them circulate," Salvara said. "Your Majesty, the continuation obligation requires." "I am aware of what it requires, Vorath." "Then you are aware that if the human cannot fulfill the obligation within the statute's timeline, the conquered will appoint a regent. The sovereignty reverts to administered status. Your bloodline ends. 60,000 years, Your Majesty." She knew. She had known since the 41st refusal, when the reality had hardened from a political problem into a personal one. The Delveni sovereignty, her people, her world, 60,000 years of continuous rule would be dissolved if she could not produce an heir. And the man the universe had sent her was a human logistics officer with instant coffee and a broken nose. "Schedule the introduction ceremony for the third day," she said. "Full court attendance." The introduction ceremony was a Delveni tradition stretching back 9 millennia. The consort presented to the noble houses, formally acknowledged, given the sovereign's mark a temporary glyph painted on the wrist in bioluminescent pigment that bound them to the queen's household. It was meant to be a moment of recognition, the court witnessing the sovereign's choice and affirming it with the pressed fist salute. What it became was something closer to a public humiliation. Ward stood in the center of the great hall, surrounded by 300 Delveni nobles, who ranged from openly hostile to icily indifferent. He was the only non-Delveni in the room, the only one without retractable claws, without infrared sensing pits along the jaw, without the dark iridescent skin that shifted color with emotional state. He stood out like a stone in water. The hall's obsidian columns caught the ceremonial light and threw his shadow in 4 directions, and he cast it alone. Salvara watched from the sovereign's dais. She watched Vorath recite the formal acknowledgement in a tone that stripped it of all warmth. She watched the noble houses decline, one by one, to offer the traditional welcome, the pressed fist salute that signified acceptance of the consort's place. House Sethakara declined. House Vokin declined. House Drasari declined without even making eye contact. She watched 300 Delveni look at the human and see exactly what 47 suitors had seen when they looked at her, something beneath them. And she watched Ward stand through all of it without flinching. When it was over and the hall had emptied, Ward remained where he was, alone on the presentation floor, the sovereign's mark still wet on his wrist. The bioluminescent pigment glowed faintly in the dimming light, a pale, uncertain gold, like something trying to take hold and not sure it would be allowed to. Salvara descended from the dais. She stopped 3 meters from him. The distance was deliberate. "They will not accept you," she said. "I noticed," Ward said. "This arrangement may destroy what remains of my authority." "It might." She studied him again. The bioluminescent glyph on his wrist was already beginning to settle into his skin, a chemical reaction between Delveni pigment and human tissue that the bioengineers had warned might cause an allergic response. His wrist was faintly reddened around the mark, but he had not mentioned it. She could see the slight swelling, the histamine response darkening the tissue around the glyph's edges. It would be uncomfortable, possibly painful. "You could still withdraw," she said. "The statute allows a cooling period of 15 days. Ward looked at the glyph on his wrist, then back at her. "Does it hurt?" he asked. She blinked. "The ceremony." "The mark, when you receive the sovereign's glyph, does it hurt?" No one had ever asked her that. The sovereign's own glyph was applied at the age of 12, a permanent bioluminescent pattern that traced from the back of her hand to her shoulder, reacting to her emotional state in ways she had learned to suppress decades ago. It had burned for 9 days. She had not cried. A sovereign did not cry. She had lain awake in the dark of the royal quarters and felt her arm burn and told herself that a queen's duty was heavier than pain. "Yes," she said. Ward nodded. "Then I'll keep mine." He turned and walked back toward the consort's wing, and Silvara stood alone in the empty hall and felt the sovereign's glyph on her own arm pulse once, a brief flare of deep gold that she smothered before it could reach her wrist. The weeks that followed were a war of attrition. Silvara did not make it easy for him. She told herself this was necessary, that the court needed to see the consort tested, that the noble houses needed to see her authority was not softened by his presence, that the conquered's observers needed to see that the Delveni sovereignty had not been compromised by a human. But the truth, which she admitted to no one, was simpler. She was waiting for him to leave. They always left. The suitors who had come before the refusals in the early months when her advisors still believed a Delveni match was possible had lasted days at most. The palace was too dark. The food was too strange. The queen was too fierce, too direct, too unwilling to perform the softness they expected. She gave Ward every reason to go. She scheduled their required meals together at the traditional Delveni hour deep into the night cycle, when the fortress was at its coldest, and the obsidian walls radiated a chill that made humans shiver. She served Delveni cuisine without modification: raw mineral-dense proteins, fermented root pastes, bitter alkaloid teas that she knew human taste receptors processed as astringent. She kept the dining hall at Delveni standard temperature, 12 degrees below what humans considered comfortable. Ward ate what was placed in front of him. He did not complain. On the fourth night, she watched him take a deliberate bite of fermented Karesh root, a delicacy that most off-worlders found actively repulsive. Chew it thoroughly, swallow, and reach for another piece. His jaw worked the texture without grimacing. His eyes watered slightly from the alkaloid burn, but he blinked it away and kept eating. "You don't have to eat that," she said, before she could stop herself. Ward looked at her. "Is it what you eat?" "It is what my people eat." "Then I'll eat it." She wanted to find that infuriating. She wanted to classify it as performance, as manipulation, as a human's desperate attempt to ingratiate himself. But his expression when she watched it was neither eager nor performative. It was simply present. He ate because the food was offered. He stayed because he said he would. She assigned him to the palace's infrastructure review, a sprawling, thankless project cataloging the fortress's failing life support systems, its corroded water reclamation units, its aging thermal regulators. It was work beneath a consort. It was work she gave him to make a point. Ward completed the first section in 3 days. He submitted a 40-page report with diagrams, cost estimates, and a prioritized repair schedule that broke each project into phases and identified which repairs could be done immediately with existing materials. The report was precise, unsentimental, and identified 7 critical failures that Silvara's own engineering corps had been minimizing for years. One of them, a cascading fault in the northern heating grid, was within weeks of a failure that would have left 200 mining settlement workers without heat during Kethnora's deep winter. She read it twice. The second time, she caught herself making notes in the margin. The third time, she realized she had forgotten to be angry about it. On the 10th day, the first minor incident occurred. A noble house functionary from House Drassari, a mid-level administrator named Kevin, deliberately countermanded Ward's request for replacement parts from the palace stores. The parts were standard thermal couplings, available in surplus, and the request had been properly filed through the engineering bay. Kevin denied it on the grounds that a human had no authorization to requisition Delveni sovereign materials. Ward did not complain to Silvara. She learned about it from the engineering bay's overnight logs, which she had quietly begun reviewing after the 40-page report. She summoned Kevin and reversed the denial without explanation. Kevin's skin mottled with indigo, the chromatic signal for humiliation, and Silvara watched him leave and felt nothing. The parts were delivered to the engineering bay the same afternoon. Ward said nothing about it. She found to her discomfort that she had wanted him to. On the 18th day, she found him in the lower corridors of the fortress, crouched beside a thermal relay that had been failing for months, his sleeves rolled to the elbow and his hands deep in the access panel. The bioluminescent glyph on his wrist pulsed faintly in the dark. It had not faded the way the bioengineers said it would. If anything, it had settled deeper, brighter, as if his skin had decided to keep it. "That relay is scheduled for replacement," she said from the corridor entrance. Ward did not look up. "Scheduled for replacement in 8 months. It'll fail in 2. The backup it's supposed to cascade to hasn't been serviced since your father's reign." She crossed her arms. "How do you know that?" "I checked the service logs. And I talked to Initiate Thesson in the engineering bay. She's been flagging it for 3 years. Nobody listened." Thesson, one of the youngest members of the engineering corps, a minor house Delveni with no political standing, and a tendency to file reports that were technically excellent and politically inconvenient. Silvara had never spoken to her directly. The reports had been routed through Vorath's office, where they had been acknowledged, filed, and ignored. "You talked to my engineering staff." "I talked to everyone." Ward's hands moved inside the access panel with the practiced efficiency of someone who had fixed things his entire life. "Your steward, your kitchen crew, the guard rotation on the northern perimeter, the archivist who catalogs the old imperial records." He paused, then added without emphasis, "They're good people. They're doing hard work with old equipment and no support, and they're too afraid of your court to tell you what's actually breaking." Silvara's claws extended, a reflex she did not suppress quickly enough. "My court." "Your court is afraid of you," Ward said. He looked at her then, his dark eyes steady, his hands still in the panel. "Your people aren't. There's a difference." The silence between them stretched for a long time. Long enough for Silvara to feel the glyph on her arm pulse again, deeper this time, a resonance she had not felt since the day it was applied. She had built her court on fear because fear was reliable. It kept the noble houses in order. It kept the petitions manageable. It kept the 60,000-year weight of the sovereignty from crushing her. But it also kept Thesson's reports in a filing cabinet, and the northern heating grid 3 weeks from catastrophic failure, and the archivist's imperial records rotting in a damp room. "Fix the relay," she said, and walked away before the color could reach her wrist. The shift happened in increments, and she fought every one. She fought it when she found Ward in the palace kitchen on the 22nd day, teaching the kitchen staff how to prepare something called bread, a human staple that required a thermal process Delveni ovens were not designed for. He had improvised a solution involving a recalibrated plasma curing unit and a ceramic insert he had fabricated from materials in the engineering bay. The kitchen staff, 3 senior Delveni who had served the palace for decades, and who regarded innovation the way most Delveni regarded open flames, with ancestral suspicion were watching him with an expression Silvara had never seen on their faces before. Curiosity, not the wary political curiosity of the court, something warmer, something that looked, if she was honest with herself, like the beginning of trust. She fought it when Ward began attending the morning security briefings uninvited, but not turned away, because his questions were better than anyone else's. He asked about supply lines, patrol efficiency, response times for the northern mining settlements where Delveni civilians lived under increasingly precarious conditions. He asked about the frontier medical dispensary that had been requesting a resupply for 6 months. He asked why the guard rotation on the eastern perimeter had been reduced from 12 to 8 without a corresponding increase in sensor coverage. He asked the questions a consort was supposed to ask, if a consort was supposed to care about the actual functioning of the world they had been married into. None of the 47 had asked those questions. Most of them had not lasted long enough to learn that the mining settlements existed. She fought it on the 26th day, when a maintenance emergency in the northern settlement's water treatment facility required an immediate response, and the engineering corps dispatched a team that included Ward because he had, without asking permission, qualified himself on the Delveny water reclamation system and was the only person in the palace who had actually read the manufacturer's emergency protocols. He spent 11 hours in a pressurized maintenance tunnel with 3 Delveny engineers, diagnosing and repairing a filtration cascade that would have contaminated the settlement's water supply within 48 hours. When the team returned, the senior engineer, a decorated veteran named Rail, who had served in the palace engineering corps for 30 years, and who had publicly opposed Ward's presence at the daily briefings, filed a commendation. One line, the human knew what he was doing. From Rail, it was the equivalent of a standing ovation. She fought it when Voreth came to her on the 31st day with a revised petition from the noble houses, this one carrying 60 signatures, demanding the consort's removal on grounds of species incompatibility, and Ward, who had not been invited to the meeting, appeared in the doorway of her private study with a counter-petition. 60 signatures from the noble houses, he said, setting a datapad on her desk. 147 from the engineering corps, the kitchen staff, the guard rotation, the northern settlement administrators, the water treatment team, and the palace archivist. He paused. I didn't ask them to sign it. They asked me where to sign. Voreth's skin shifted to a mottled dark indigo, the Delveny chromatic signal for barely controlled fury. You have no standing to solicit. I didn't solicit, Ward said. I fixed their water reclamation unit. I reinforced the northern perimeter's sensor array. I helped the archivist digitize 14,000 years of imperial records that were rotting on physical media in a damp storage room. I repaired 2 thermal relays, recalibrated the kitchen's plasma curing system, and filed the maintenance backlog that nobody had filed in 9 years. They signed because they wanted to. Selvara looked at the counter-petition. She looked at Voreth. She looked at Ward. Leave us, she said to Voreth. When the door closed, she stood from her desk and crossed to where Ward waited. She stopped at the distance that had become their default, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to maintain the fiction that this was still a political arrangement. You are making my court very uncomfortable, she said. Good. They will retaliate. The noble houses have resources. Voreth has allies on the Concord itself. I know, he's already tried twice. Once through a formal challenge to my credentials, which I answered with my full service record, including the classified sections I had declassified for this purpose. Once through a quiet suggestion to the Concord that my psychological fitness be evaluated. I passed that too. She stared at him. You knew about the psych evaluation. I requested it myself. Preemptive. It's harder to question someone's fitness when they've already volunteered for the exam. Something happened in Selvara's chest, a loosening, a warmth that she did not have a name for and did not have a protocol for managing. It was not the admiration she felt for competence. She had competent people around her. It was not respect exactly, though respect was part of it. It was the slow, bewildering recognition that this human, this supply clerk, this broken-nosed logistics officer with his instant coffee and his 40-page reports, and his hands that fixed things without being asked, was not performing. He was not trying to impress her. He was not positioning himself for power. He was simply doing what needed to be done, because it needed to be done, and because no one else was doing it. Why? She asked again. The same question she had asked in the tribunal, but different now, quieter, rower, stripped of the edge she used to keep the world at arm's length. Ward looked at her. His dark eyes held something she had not seen from anyone in 14 years of ruling alone. The calm, steady regard of a man who was looking at her and seeing a person, not a problem. "Because you've been carrying this alone for too long," he said, "and someone should help." The glyph on her arm flared a deep, burning gold that raced from her shoulder to her wrist before she could suppress it. She turned away, but not quickly enough. He saw it. She knew he saw it because he did the one thing none of the others would have done. He said nothing. He let her keep the moment. The 45th day was when everything broke. Voreth had been assembling allies for weeks, a coalition of noble houses, conquered sympathizers, and a faction within the military who believed that a human consort weakened the Delveni's position in galactic politics. The mechanism he chose was elegant and ancient, a formal challenge under the old imperial code, invoking the right of suitability, a tradition that predated the conquered by 4,000 years, still technically enforceable under sovereign law, requiring a consort to prove their fitness through a physical trial designed for Delveni biology. The trial was a night hunt in the fortress's lower canyons, where the native predator's massive, six-legged thyreavores called Kethrin had been deliberately lured by baited game trails. The consort was expected to survive the canyon for one full night cycle, unarmed, and return with proof of a kill. For a Delveni, with their infrared vision, retractable claws, and predatory instincts honed by 60,000 years of apex evolution, it was a demanding but manageable challenge. For a human, blind in the infrared, clawless, without the thermoregulation to survive Kethnora's deep night temperatures, it was a death sentence wrapped in legal precedent. Salvara received the formal notice at midday. She read it once, set it down, and felt something she had not felt since she was 12 years old, and the sovereign's glyph was burning its way into her arm. Fury, and beneath the fury, fear. She crossed the palace to the consort's wing at a pace that made her guards jog to keep up. She found Ward in his quarters, reading the physical book from his duffel, its spine more cracked now, its pages softened from handling. He looked up when she entered, and she watched him read her expression the way he always did, carefully, without assumption, the way a man reads weather. "The right of suitability," she said. "Voreth invoked it. You have 12 hours. Ward set the book down. "What does it involve?" She told him. She described the canyon in precise detail, the depth, the temperature gradient, the Kethrin's hunting patterns, the absolute darkness of Kethnora's moonless night. She described the Kethrin themselves, 2 meters at the shoulder, 6-legged, with thermal sensing pits along their skulls and jaws that could shear through Delveni body armor. She watched his face as she spoke. She watched for the moment when the calculation would shift, when the human survival math would override whatever principle had kept him here for 45 days. She watched for the flinch. It did not come. "Can I refuse?" he asked. "If you refuse, the challenge is upheld. The court declares you unfit. The match is dissolved. I lose the sovereignty." "Then I won't refuse." "You will die in that canyon, Ward." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Maybe, but you'll still have an answer for the court. Either I survive and the challenge fails, or I don't and Voreth's proved his point. Either way, you get clarity." She stared at him. The word clarity landed on her like the 47th refusal had, like something heavy, dropped from a height. He was not bargaining. He was not negotiating an escape. He was telling her that he would walk into a dark canyon full of predators he could not see, armed with nothing, because it was what the situation required. She felt it then, the thing she had been fighting since the first night he ate the Karash root without complaining, since he fixed the relay she had used as a test, since he collected signatures from people she had never thought to ask. The recognition. Not the political kind, the kind her court traded in status, leverage, positioning. The real kind. The kind that said, "This man sees me." Not my claws, not my crown, not my teeth, me. I am going with you, she said. That's not how the right works. I am the sovereign. I define how the right works. Ward studied her face. She let him look. For the first time in 14 years, she let someone look at her without the armor of protocol between them. She did not suppress the glyph. She did not retract her claws. She let him see the queen and the person at the same time, and she watched him take both in without flinching. All right, he said. The canyon was everything she had warned him it would be. Kethnora's deep night was absolute, no moons, no ambient light, the sky a solid vault of black that pressed down on the stone walls like a weight. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in the first hour. Selvara's infrared vision painted the world in thermal gradients, the residual warmth of the canyon walls in fading orange, the cold air currents in blue-black, the distant thermal signatures of Kethryn moving in the lower reaches hot, predatory, patient. Ward could see none of it. He moved through the darkness by sound and touch, his hand trailing along the canyon wall, his breathing controlled, his footfalls deliberate. He had fashioned a crude thermal wrap from materials in his quarters, insulation stripped from spare corridor paneling, bound with engineering tape, and he carried a small knife he had taken from the kitchen, a tool meant for preparing food, not fighting six-legged predators. Selvara stayed close, close enough that her infrared vision could serve for both of them, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, the human metabolic furnace that burned so much hotter than Delveni physiology, a warmth that was startling in the frozen dark. To Kethryn on the upper ridge, she said quietly, 300 meters, moving parallel. Tracking us. Learning our pattern. They'll wait for a constriction point where we can't maneuver. Ward adjusted his route without being told, shifting away from the narrowing section ahead, keeping to the wider corridor of the canyon floor. He moved like he had spent time in the dark before, not comfortably, but competently. They did not speak for the next hour. The Kethryn were circling, she could see their thermal signatures splitting, reforming, testing the wind. 7 of them now, including a large male whose thermal signature blazed brighter than the others. An alpha. It was assessing, and its patience was a bad sign. At the 3rd hour, Ward stumbled. The cold was working into him, his core temperature dropping despite the thermal wrap, his movements losing their precision. He caught himself against the canyon wall and stood very still, breathing through his nose. Your temperature is dropping, Selvara said. I know. A Delveni would compensate with metabolic regulation. Your species cannot. I'm aware. She moved closer. She did not think about it, did not run it through the filter of protocol, did not weigh it against the political implications, did not ask herself what the court would say. She simply moved to where he was and stood beside him, her body blocking the wind that funneled through the canyon. Her skin shifted color, a deep, warm amber that she had not displayed in years, the Delveni chromatic signal for protective territoriality. In the dark, it would not be visible to him. But the heat her body generated in that state, the slight thermal increase that accompanied the chromatic shift, was. Ward went still. She felt him register the warmth, felt him understand what it meant, or at least understand that it meant something. Thank you, he said. She said nothing. She kept the amber. At the 4th hour, she felt the Kethryn Alpha commit. Its thermal signature surged as its metabolism spiked for a sprint, and 2 flankers dropped from the upper ridge in a coordinated pattern. 3 incoming, she said. 2 from above, 1 from the floor, fast. Ward moved not away but forward, the kitchen knife in his hand, his body dropping into a low stance she recognized as a human combat form. He could not see them. He was fighting blind, orienting on nothing but her voice and the sound of claws on stone. Selvara's claws extended. The sovereign's glyph on her arm blazed gold in the darkness, bright enough that even Ward could see it, a flare of bioluminescence that illuminated the canyon walls in amber gold and caught the Kethrin mid-lunge. The Alpha hesitated. The flankers broke stride. The light was wrong, unexpected, and predators, even apex predators, distrusted what they did not understand. She struck the nearest flanker across the throat. Her claws opened 4 parallel wounds that steamed in the cold air. The creature screamed a sound like tearing metal, and the Alpha snarled, low and considering. It circled once, twice, its thermal signature pulsing as it assessed the new threat. Not one prey animal, but 2, and one of them was lit up like a signal fire. Ward held his position, kitchen knife forward, back to the wall, eyes locked on the brightest point of the glyph's glow. He could not see the Alpha, but he could hear it, and when it lunged, he stepped into the charge instead of away from it, a move that no Delveni would have made, because it was suicidal, because it relied on the predator's own momentum to carry it past the blade. The knife caught the Alpha across the shoulder, not deep enough to kill, deep enough to hurt. The Kethrin screamed and wheeled, and Selvara was already there, claws extended, the glyph blazing, driving the wounded animal back into the dark. The third flanker fled without engaging. Silence. The canyon walls echoed once and went still. Ward was breathing hard. His thermal wrap was torn where the Alpha's claws had grazed his ribs, a shallow wound, 3 parallel lines that seeped dark in the glyph's fading light. He pressed his hand against the wound and looked at Selvara. "You could have let it take me," he said. "The right would be satisfied, failed consort, no challenge to your authority." "Shut up," she said. He almost smiled. She saw it, the faint shift at the corners of his mouth, the micro-expression that in a Delveni would have been accompanied by a chromatic flare. In a human, it was just a face, doing what faces did when someone surprised them with honesty. They survived the night. 6 more hours of cold and dark and circling predators that kept their distance after the Alpha's retreat. Selvara stayed close to Ward, her amber warmth steady against his failing thermoregulation, her infrared scanning the ridges. At one point, deep in the 5th hour, she realized that she had positioned herself between him and the nearest thermal signature without thinking about it. Not as a tactical decision, as a reflex. The way you stood between something you valued and something that threatened it. The thought unsettled her more than the Kethrin. At dawn, when the first thermal shift painted the canyon walls in pale orange, Selvara dragged the flanker's carcass back to the canyon's mouth, where Voreth and the court were waiting. 300 Delveni nobles, arranged in formal observation rank, their skin carefully neutral. She dropped the carcass at the senior advisor's feet. The impact scattered dust across his ceremonial boots. "The consort's kill," she said, "witnessed and attested by the sovereign." Voreth's skin went gray, the Delveni signal for shock overlaying the signal for barely concealed fury. "Your Majesty, the right requires that the consort act alone. The right requires proof of fitness. The consort survived a night in the deep canyon without infrared vision, without thermoregulation, without claws. He stood his ground against a Kethrin Alpha charge with a kitchen knife. He drew blood from an apex predator that outmassed him by a factor of 6. She let the silence hold. He did not run. He did not ask for quarter. He did not invoke the exit clause. She paused. "The 47 who refused me would not have lasted an hour." The court said nothing. 300 Delveni nobles, standing in the dawn light, looking at a human with a bruised face and 3 shallow claw marks on his ribs, and a borrowed kitchen knife, and a bioluminescent glyph that burned steady gold on his wrist, despite every biological prediction that it should have faded weeks ago. It was Thesson, the young engineer from the lower ranks, the one Ward had listened to when no one else would, who moved first. She crossed the distance from the back of the crowd, stopped in front of Ward and pressed her fist to her chest. The Delveni welcome. The gesture that 300 nobles had refused at the introduction ceremony, 42 days ago. Behind her, a guard from the northern perimeter did the same. Then a kitchen steward. Then Rail, the senior engineer who had filed the one-line commendation. Then the palace archivist, a woman who had served 4 sovereigns and had never once offered the welcome to anyone outside the imperial bloodline. One by one, from the lower ranks upward, the people who had worked beside Ward, who had watched him fix their systems, eat their food, ask their names, listen to their concerns, walk into a canyon full of predators because the alternative was to let their queen lose her throne, press their fists to their chests. Voreth watched it happen. The indigo drained from his skin, replaced by the flat gray of a man who understood that he had lost something he could not petition to reclaim. Not the political battle, something older, the assumption that the human did not belong. "Ratify the match," Silvara said to Dren, who had remained at the canyon's edge with his tribunal tablet, his translucent hands folded in what might have been wonder. "Permanent status, full sovereign recognition." Dren entered the notation. The tablet chimed once, and the sound of its small, clean final carried across the canyon mouth like a bell. That evening, in the sovereign's private study, Silvara sat across from Ward at the small table where she took her meals alone. The table had been set for 2 since the day he arrived, but this was the first time she had invited him to eat there instead of in the formal dining hall. The food was still Delveni. She had not changed it, but beside the traditional Karash root and alkaloid tea, there was a small plate with 2 thick slices of the bread he had taught the kitchen staff to make imperfect, slightly too dense, baked in a repurposed plasma curing unit that still smelled faintly of industrial sealant. Ward looked at the bread. He looked at her. "You had the kitchen make this," he said. "Thesson suggested it. She said you eat it every morning." "I do. It smells strange." "It does." Silvara picked up a piece and took a careful bite. The taste was unlike anything in the Delveni palate, warm, yeasty, faintly sweet, with a texture that resisted her teeth in a way that Delveni food never did. She chewed it slowly. She swallowed. "It is acceptable," she said. Ward's eyes crinkled. Not a smile, exactly something quieter than that, something that lived in the lines around his eyes and the way his shoulders dropped half an inch, as if he had been carrying something heavy and had just set it down. Silvara looked at the glyph on his wrist. It had been 45 days. In every previous case, the consort's glyph faded within the first week, a polite biochemical rejection, the body refusing what did not belong. Ward's glyph had not faded. It had deepened. The bioluminescent pigment had integrated into his tissue in a way the bioengineers said was impossible for a non-Delveni organism, bonding with human melanocytes in a pattern that was neither Delveni nor human but something new. It pulsed now in rhythm with his heartbeat, steady, warm gold. She looked at her own glyph. The sovereign's mark applied at 12, the one that had burned for 9 days. It was pulsing too, the same rhythm, the same gold. "The glyphs are synchronized," she said. "I noticed. That has never happened with a non-Delveni. In 9,000 years of recorded pairings, it has never happened." "I know, Thesson told me. She's been running tissue samples for the last 2 weeks. He paused. She cried a little when the results came back. I think she said the word unprecedented 4 times. Silvara felt the glyph on her arm flare again, not a brief pulse this time, but a sustained warmth that spread from her shoulder to her fingertips, a deep gold that meant something she had taught herself not to feel because feeling it had never been safe. 14 years of ruling alone, 14 years of fear disguised as authority, of solitude disguised as strength, 14 years of telling herself that the sovereign's glyph burned because duty was supposed to hurt. "The court will say it proves nothing," she said. "The court can say what it likes. They will say it is a biochemical anomaly, a fluke of cross-species reactivity. Maybe it is. It is not. The words came out before she could stop them, and she heard them land in the quiet room like a stone dropped into still water. She looked at Ward. He was watching her with the same steady regard he had shown from the first moment in the tribunal, the look that did not flinch, did not calculate, did not perform. The look that had seen 47 men walk away and had disagreed. "I know," he said. Selvara stood. She crossed to where he sat and stopped, not at the careful distance they had maintained for 45 days, but at the distance where she could see the individual threads of gray in his dark hair, and the fine scar that ran along his jaw, and the bioluminescent glyph that pulsed gold on his wrist in time with her own heartbeat. She extended her hand, palm down, the Delveni gesture of invitation, older than the sovereignty itself, older than the conquered, older than the statute that had brought him here. The one that predated courts and contracts and glyphs. The one that meant, "I see you. Stay." Ward looked at her hand. He reached up slowly and placed his palm beneath hers, not clasping, not gripping, just resting there, warm and steady and present. The human warmth against the Delveni cool. Two metabolisms, two evolutionary histories, two species that had no biological reason to fit together, touching in a way that no statute had required and no tribunal had ratified. The glyphs on both their arms blazed gold, bright enough to illuminate the study, bright enough that the guard outside the door would later report seeing light spill under the threshold like liquid amber. 47 men looked at me and saw a problem, Selvara said quietly. You looked at me and saw a person. That's because you are one, Ward said. You just forgot. She did not forget again. Outside in the corridor, Thesson passed the study door on her way to the engineering bay for a late shift. She saw the golden light seeping under the threshold, warm and steady and synchronized, and she paused. She pressed her fist to her chest, the welcome, offered to no one and to both of them at once, and walked on. The glyph on the Queen's arm burned steady and warm and gold, and for the first time in 14 years, she did not try to dim it.